morning. So I was hoping to wrap up the discussion / study on Christian participation or involvement in the political affairs of this world. And before we do that, well, this is part of it. I left this out a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the leaven of Herod. And I had mentioned that the Herodian family, each of the successive leaders would be called Herod, just like there was one Caesar, Julius Caesar, but after Julius's death, the title or the name Caesar became a title. And so was the case with Herod. You had Herod the Great, who was the first, but then his sons were all called Herod. And they were put into power as kings of the Jews by Caesar. And in order to remain in that position as king of the Jews, you would have to be making concessions with Caesar, who put you into power, who can knock you out of power. And there was this term called friend of Caesar. In fact, I think it is mentioned once in scriptures when Jesus is being tried, and I don't know if the Sadducees said, like, if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar's. That wasn't just simply a random statement. That was actually a title that was used in that time period. So what you see up on the screen, I know is rather muddy, fuzzy, blurry, but that's a coin, and you're seeing the front and the back side of a coin. You never would know it, but the left side, that's, I guess you could make it out. It kind of looks like a head of a human. That's actually Caesar. Let me make sure I got it right. I want to say Claudius. Yeah, it was the Roman Emperor Claudius Caesar. And what was most important is what's on the back side, which is on the right. And I prefaced it with the statement how you need to be a friend of Caesar if you're going to maintain power at that time. In fact, I would argue that when Jesus was tempted about, bow down, worship me, and I'll give you all these kingdoms of the world, that could have only been a reference to Caesar, because Caesar was the only one who would have the power to grant the kingdoms of the world to anyone in the Mediterranean region at the time. So what do you see on the right side? It's very, very intriguing. You can tell there's kind of like a structure, an architectural structure, and it looks like there's two figures below that. Well, that actually is the temple of Jupiter. And one of the figures is the Emperor Claudius Caesar. The other person is Herod Agrippa. And Herod Agrippa it's believed to be the Herod that you read about in the book of Acts when the Christian church was being persecuted, when I think he had James, the brother of John, put to death, and then he arrested Peter, and that's when Peter got into prison, and that story. But that's the Herod. It's believed to be the one, the other figure. And you may not be able to tell it, but they're actually shaking hands. But what's most important is the inscription around it. It reads, Basilius Megas Agrippus Philokaiser, or Philokaiser, which is the most important word. So around the top here, in fact, you can see the Basilius right here. And I think you'd have your Philokaiser. Now, anyone remember when we were doing the study on anti-Semitism, we talked about what was the word? Philo-Semitism? It was a friend of the Jews. There's anti-Semitism, which is you're opposed to the Jewish people. Well, Philo Kaiser, Philo, from which we get a friend or a lover. If you say philosophy, you're a lover of knowledge or wisdom. And a Philo Kaiser is a friend of Caesar. So you have here the head of the Jewish state, Herod Agrippa, appearing, shaking hands with Claudius Caesar, and he's being identified as a friend of Caesar, and it's in front of a temple of Jupiter. And I just thought this coin was really fascinating because you have this mixture of the religious and the political. Clearly, Claudius Caesar was the political. But the Jewish people were a people, yeah, they were a political entity, but they were a people, a kingdom of priests, a holy people that were called out. They were more than just simply a political entity. So I found this coin fascinating in that you have this combining of the two. You might call it an early version of church and state. And you cannot maintain power without being a friend of Caesar. And the compromises that come with it, I just said, Herod put James, Peter into prison. And you do what's politically expedient in order to maintain power. And I've said many times in this discussion, you cannot hold a position of power in a national or even a state local level unless you are okay with the concept of using violence to maintain that power and to enforce your laws. And that's where we have problems as followers of Jesus, and why we need to keep a distance from the political systems of this world, or the kingdoms of men. So anyway, I talked about this before. I kept telling you about it, I kept forgetting to bring it. It wasn't part of my original slide set, and I stuck it in yesterday. So that was part of the discussion about the beware of the leaven of Herod. All right, so I'm going to move forward. We were trying to wrap up, and I was summarizing all the numerous reasons why it's a bad idea for a follower of Jesus to get involved in the political system. And then I took a question that we had received from one of the Zoom watchers talking about participation in school boards. Okay, so all that we're going to put behind us. There was one question left that the Zoomer had brought up. You hadn't seen it. It was given to me privately by Walter, but I wanted to address this. And this was one of the reasons why, an argument that's brought forward as to why we should get involved in the political process. And the argument was something like, and Walter, you can correct me if I got it wrong, if there is clearly an evil individual or threat that's, let's say, on the ballot, and we have the opportunity to vote against that individual from gaining power, that we would be negligent in allowing that evil person to get into power. Is that kind of the gist of it, Walter? And I think you brought up Hitler, that the individual brought up Hitler as an example, that if Hitler was on the ballot, we'd be negligent if we didn't do something from a political standpoint, if we just sat back and let Hitler ascend to power. So I wanted to address that question. How many here have actually studied the Third Reich, the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany in the 1920s, 30s, 40s? Anyone? I think I see one hand, two hands, three. It's a fascinating story. It's complex, but it's really fascinating. I will cut to the quick. Hitler was never on the ballot. Well, I want to take that back. So in Germany, and this takes a little bit of wrapping our heads around because we're in a different form of of government. We have a constitutional democracy. In Germany, there's a parliamentary democracy, if you want to call it that, where when you vote, you're not voting for an individual, you're voting for a party. Now, if anyone's familiar with the format of the Israeli government, you don't vote for Benjamin Netanyahu, you vote for his Likud party. And then the party, if it has a majority, which sometimes it has to form a coalition with other parties in order to then choose a prime minister. That's very similar to what was in place in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Germany. So the National Socialist Party was a party that Adolf Hitler created, and it actually started to do quite well. I think at the most, maybe it got like 32, 33, 36% of the vote. But just because the National Socialist Party is put into power doesn't mean Adolf Hitler is going to become what would be the equivalent of a prime minister in Germany is called a chancellor. Okay, so you have parties you choose, a majority then picks a chancellor, and he's the one that wields the greatest amount of power in that country. Now there's also a figurehead, to make things even more confusing, called the president. In Israel, there's a president of Israel, and there's a prime minister of Israel. Everyone hears about the prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu, but very few people, anyone here knows the name of the president of Israel? Okay, that's what I thought. And it's something similar to like in England, you have a parliament, and they choose a prime minister, and yet you also have a figurehead, a figure of state, which would be the queen or the king. So think, British monarchy parliamentary system in Germany, except for it's called a chancellor, not a prime minister. And you have a figurehead, head of state, which kind of does, like the ribbon cutting and some of the formalities of state. And he would have been called the president. So you have the National Socialist Party, which I should share some of the platform items with you. And actually, if you had read it, it's not so bad considering the chaos that was going on in Germany at the time. Yeah, there was this anti-Semitism in that they wanted to deport all the Jews. But other than that, it really wasn't a bad platform. And you could see why someone who's, in up to date in politics and one of the best for the country, why they would vote for the National Socialists. So, at the time there was, let me get the picture up here. The president of Germany was the gentleman on the left side, dressed in the military uniform. His name was Paul von Hindenburg, and he is best known by the blimp or dirigible or whatever, before Goodyear had blimps, they had the Hindenburg, and everyone knows about the disaster that took place in 1937. He was dead by the time the Hindenburg disaster occurred. In fact, I believe he was on his last leg when he had to deal with Adolf Hitler. And the situation was that, I'm trying to think, it was 1932, there was elections, and the National Socialist, there was no party that got the majority. I think the biggest party winners were the National Socialists and the Communist parties. And when you can't find a majority, if a party cannot get the majority, it has to form a coalition with another party. And then if they can't decide, if that can't happen, what happens is the president chooses the next chancellor. Okay, so I hope everyone's confused. So what happened is Hindenburg, he knew Hitler's reputation of being a troublemaker, and he just was not, he just called him like he was a house painter, called Hitler basically a house painter. And Hindenburg swore he was not going to appoint Hitler as Chancellor of Germany In fact, Hindenburg approached another leader in the National Socialist Party. So just because you form the National Socialist Party doesn't mean that you would be the shoe-in for the next chancellor. So Hindenburg asks another leader in the National Socialist Party to be the next chancellor because of this kind of being unable to create a coalition, a majority, to pick a chancellor. So this fell to Hindenburg. Hindenburg chose somebody else. Well, this other individual from the National Socialist Party made the mistake of going to Adolf Hitler and letting him know that this was the plan. And Hitler just flew into a rage. And the one who was going to be the next chancellor of Germany after Hitler's volcanic reaction, he left the National Socialist Party, which left Hindenburg with this dilemma. He ended up choosing yet another individual, but not from the National Socialist Party. And if I'm not mistaken, there was like a total of 3 individuals in the 32-33 time period that Hindenburg was trying to get to be the next chancellor. But each one, there was problems that occurred. So Hitler was quite shrewd. He realized that these, we won't call them interim chancellors, were not working out. Hitler, approached the aristocrats, the industrialists, the wealthy class, and sweet-talked them, or at least convinced them that he should be the next chancellor. And he would say something like, well, if you allow the communists to get into power, you're going to lose your businesses, you're going to lose your industry, you're going to lose your, mansions or whatever. You don't want the communists to fall, become the next dominant power in Germany. And we have the next largest bloc. You need to side with the National Socialists. They then started ringing the phone and bugging the death out of Hindenburg, saying, you really should appoint Hitler as the next chancellor. And then Hitler went to Hindenburg's son and also convinced him that the National Socialist Party was the right party to get Germany out of its crazy state that it was in. All that tickling of the ear caused Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. So Hitler was never on the ballot for Chancellor because you can't even be on the ballot as Chancellor. It's a position that the party or coalition chooses. So to say that you could prevent Hitler from gaining power would have been extremely, extremely difficult. The only way you could have done that is you'd have to have had a crystal ball and you would have had to have a gun. And you'd have to shoot him dead. It would be about the only way you could have kept Hitler out of power. Anyone who follows, if you go into study, it is incredible how he did ascend into power. And even Hindenburg, he was on his deathbed, he says, I sure hope I don't look down from heaven when I die and regret this decision. And one of his aides said, sir, I'm not even sure you're going to be in heaven if you allow Hitler to gain power. So Hindenburg did not want to appoint Hitler. He was sweet-talked or, convinced he had no other choice. And then when Hitler was into power, you had the fire, the Reichstag fire, which was the equivalent of our Capitol going up in flames. He declared emergency powers, kind of like martial law, and the next thing he became a dictator, and that's it. So to say that, Hitler would be an example where we should try to prevent him from gaining power, it would have been impossible short of having a gun. And speaking of which, there were multiple assassination attempts of Hitler's life over the duration of his power. Anyone heard of, I remember his name, the German Protestant preacher, Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer. He was in the resistance movement. Now, Bonhoeffer was not part of any of the plots, but he was part of the resistance. The resistance did try to assassinate Hitler. The very last attempt, I think it was, may have been in 43, 44, they had a suitcase full of explosives. Someone in the resistance was part of the military or part of Hitler's entourage, brought the explosive-laden briefcase into the room with Hitler, and like at the last minute, someone picked it up and moved it. And when it did explode, Hitler was far enough, and the table, this was back before they had, pressed wood table. This is a solid table. It prevented the explosion from harming Hitler. I think he was shocked and lost some hearing. Once there was an investigation into how that happened, they found that the German resistance was responsible, and then the Nazis went out and started to round up everyone in the German resistance and put them to death. And even if you weren't involved in the plot to kill Hitler, if you were simply part of that group, and which Bonhoeffer was, you were going to be arrested, which was what happened to Bonhoeffer, and eventually he was killed. So it's not so easy just to say, well, there's an evil person, we're going to stop him through the political process. It's just not that easy. Moreover, here's something to think about, and this one's probably going to cause some of us to squirm about Hitler. And I found this in the, I don't think it was a Testimony magazine. I'll get caught up here. All right, so I have a little note here. The idea that you can somehow predict who is going to be evil when they are elected is very hard. Moreover, as hard as it is to accept, perhaps God wants an evil person in power to fulfill his will. And that might be hard for many of us to accept, that God may in fact want an evil person in power to fulfill his will. And you might say that's a crazy idea, but let me put forward some evidence to support my statement. Let me ask you a question. Was Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, evil? Randy seems to be very eager to say yes. What's some examples of Nebuchadnezzar being evil?
He worshipped false gods.
He worshipped false gods. Anything else?
Very cruel.
He could be cruel. So he threw the three young Hebrew boys into the fire because they wouldn't worship his idol. But the question is, was Nebuchadnezzar then a tool of God? Did God want Nebuchadnezzar to be into power? So God wants this cruel, evil idolater in power. So this is what we need to remember. God rules in the kingdoms of men. And what we look at and say this person is not qualified, we need to rethink, well, that may in fact be what God wants. David?
I was just going to say that, Jesus has given us the book of Revelation, and that book basically has told us of things that would shortly come to pass. And these things are from the time of AD 96, I believe, all the way up until his return. And the prophecies that have been given to us in Revelation are telling us exactly what's going to happen. And the drying up of the Turkish Empire was prophesied there. And so all of this stuff has already been determined, okay? God already has all this planned out. He's told us how it's going to happen. And, the prophet Daniel, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel 4:17, he says, "The sentence is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the lowliest of men."
Yeah.
Okay, so what you've got here now, there was a Christian preacher in, I think, in the 1930s that was really kind of making fun of Brother Thomas, Elpis Israel, talking about how the Jews were going to return to Israel. And I've actually got the comment. He made the comment, he said, God can do miracles and all kinds of wonderful things, but he says, what in the world is going to make thousands of Jews leave their homeland, their country, their friends, their families, and go to a land where they would be, at that point in time, the Arabs were in charge of that. It's like, he was just saying nobody in their right mind would do that.
Yeah.
Well, that right there is what caused that to happen.
Yeah.
And so, we've got people, at least Christadelphian brothers, I've heard say that World War I freed the land. World War II got the people to the land. And World War III is going to get Jesus to the earth. So, yeah,
Right.
if you would have voted against this, you would have been voting against God's will.
Yeah. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar, what did he do to Jerusalem? Did he spruce it up? No, he tore it down. No, desecrated it, tore it down. Yeah. And you could look at, well, what about Pharaoh? Oh, even before we get there, let me see if I've got a passage to read. This verse. I got another one here, Jeremiah 27:6. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. My servant. God is calling Nebuchadnezzar my servant. And I have given him the animals of the field to serve him. So even the beasts of the field, God is saying, are going to serve this wicked, evil idolater who just destroyed Jerusalem. And remember, Paul describes Pharaoh as the one who tried to kill all the baby boys in Egypt, who 10 times resisted God's messenger. Yet Paul describes Pharaoh as, in Romans 9:17, let's see if I got it. Nope, I'm kind of behind myself. Romans 9:17, for the scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up, so Yahweh speaking, God raised you up for this very reason, so that I could show my power in front of you, and so that my name would be proclaimed in all the earth. So God can and does use wicked and evil men in positions of power, even though we find them totally despicable. So as hard as it is to accept, we can make the argument that Hitler, despite how evil he was nonetheless a tool which God used to further his plan to restore the Jewish people back to their homeland. Now, am I saying it was a good thing that 6 million Jews were killed? No, obviously, no one in the right, well, I wouldn't say no one, but we wouldn't think of that. But was there something that was beneficial to God's plan that resulted from that? The answer is yes. So with respect to Adolf Hitler, I found it was interesting that some people thought Hitler, shortly after he was placed into power, thought Hitler was, quote unquote, a messenger of God. And I found this from the Testimony magazine in 1935. And with this, this is going to provide our segue back into the study on anti-Semitism. What better way to get back to anti-Semitism than to talk about Adolf Hitler? So this, I'm going to put my glasses on. What was the reason? Well, that's what I'm going to get into. Okay, so this is August 1935, Hitler, messenger of God. I think I have highlighted, here we go. So when William Zuckerman, in an article in the Fortnightly Review entitled, quote, Nazis Without a Jewish Policy, unquote, writes, some Zionists frequently speak of Hitler as a messenger of God sent to further the work of Zionism. We perhaps are startled at first, but presently are awed by the realization that although obliquely put, a divine truth operative in our own times has been stated. A strange view, people will think, Hitler, a messenger of God? What of Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Pharaoh? Did Paul's conviction die with him? When did the powers that be cease to be ordered by God? An average Persian might have remarked inconsequentially to his neighbor in one of the years about BC 500 that the king, I skipped another section. So this is 1935, okay? This is before Kristallnacht, before concentration camps. And we have a Zionist magazine referring to Hitler as the messenger of God. And the reason is he was provoking many of the Jews to leave Germany and to seek Palestine. So this is another section of the article. I'm not going to read the whole article. This section I've got here, planning a new exodus. What the Nazis want and are aiming at is really not emigration, but an exodus of the Jews. What they would prefer and what would have suited best their sense of the dramatic would be an act of Jewish expulsion, such as was accomplished in the Middle Ages. But unfortunately for them, expulsions are not practicable in Europe in the 20th century, and the same end has to be achieved indirectly under the guise of the more civilized name of immigration. In this latest effort by the Nazi regime reaches strange paradoxes. Probably the most extraordinary of all is the fact that the government actually promotes, encourages, and advances the Zionist movement in Germany. Can you believe that? The Nazi Party was actually promoting the Zionist cause in Germany. When Germany was shutting down the presses, all the opposition presses, they left the Zionist presses running because it served their purpose to encourage the Jews to immigrate out of Germany. The Zionist organization is the only political party other than the Nazi which is permitted. The Zionist newspapers are not only not suppressed, but are flourishing while non-Zionist publications are languishing. Zionist meetings are encouraged while meetings of non-Zionist Jews, even the Jewish ex-soldiers, are suppressed. The Zionist training centers which prepare Jewish youth for work in Palestine are permitted to go on with their work, while similar Jewish schools which train pupils to work in Germany are prohibited. It's fascinating. The next section, I'm jumping to, it's not consecutive. I'm just pulling out some of the tidbits. In fairness to the Zionists, the writer proceeds, it must be said that until recently they did not accept willingly this favoritism. At least the more liberal Zionists felt ill at ease with the active partnership with the Nazi into which they have been forced. But whether Zionists want it or not, they cannot get away from the fact that they share with the Nazis the underlying principles of National Socialism. Well, they both want an exodus of Jews from Germany. The Zionist theory fully accepts and supports the Nazi claim of the alienism of the Jews in Germany and in other countries of their birth. Some Zionists frequently speak of Hitler as a messenger of God sent to further the work of Zionism. All Zionist activity is directed toward the principal aim of the Nazis, that of Jewish emigration from Germany. It was a Zionist scheme that was recently perfected for the mass emigration of all Jews from Germany within 25 years. So eager is the Nazi regime to bring about a Jewish exodus of this type that it is ready to lend its full support even to a Jewish social movement, so long as it furthers such an object, unquote. Mr. Zuckerman goes on to show that there are difficulties, but then the decree of Cyrus was not carried out without the overcoming of many difficulties which in fact persisted for many years. From another source, I learned that up to June 15, 1935, an estimate of the distribution of refugees from Germany as a result of Hitler's policy includes the following. And it was interesting, you look at these numbers, these are the countries to which Jews at that time, up to that point, had emigrated to. And look at the numbers. Number one, I mean, hands over, winner, 27,000, 5 times, well, not 5, 4.5 times greater than any other country. Oh, I take that back. Scandinavian country says 10,000. Nonetheless, the point's made that the majority, or a huge percentage of these Jews fleeing Germany were headed to where? To Palestine. Palestine continues to be, as it has been from the very first, we are told, the chief country of refuge for the Jewish exiles from Germany. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 resulted in the opening up of Palestine as a national home for the Jews, which David had mentioned. Germany, fretful under the indignities of the Versailles Treaty and aggravated by the poverty which it wrought, rallied to the call of an erstwhile Austrian corporal, reference to Hitler, and he, Hitler, is the instrument which is sending thousands of otherwise unwilling Jews back to Palestine. And so we witness, as a matter of ordinary politics, God ruling in the kingdom of men, and the seeming strangeness of the events is explained. I mean, this is really amazing. 1935. Would we ever dare calling Hitler a messenger of God? And of course, the word messenger is usually translated in our Bibles as angel. Think of Hitler as an angel of God. Crazy stuff. So this is another reason why we should think twice about making statements about who God wants and doesn't want in power. I mean, for me, the next 4 years was going to be tough. But that's God's plan, and I'm just sitting on the sidelines watching to see how this is going to play out. And that, I suggest, is the proper position of a follower of Jesus, not to be participants, but rather to be strangers, pilgrims, if you want to call it, sitting on the sidelines. So I think with that, I think we can put a bow around it and tie it up and say that's the end of that study. Walter?
Just as a note on that word evil, it's been a while since I did this study. I know there are like several words in the Old Testament and the New Testament for evil. One of the most prevalent one in the Old Testament defines evil as being immoral, thus a person who goes against the will and the law of God. And so you can think of someone like Nebuchadnezzar. Well,
Sure, a pagan worshiper.
yes, exactly.
Pretty
Immoral in that sense, and yes, he had also the other word, he had the cruelty about him. But if we remember that most famous verses, God rules in the kingdom of men. He sees men's kingdom, he sees his kingdom, and he says, I'm in charge. And so he often, it says, he's even setting up the basis of men. Well, that word basis can have two different meanings depending on the context. It can mean the most lowest scum of the earth you're thinking about, or it can mean the most humblest of people,
Right.
which we eventually saw Nebuchadnezzar learn a lot about.
I had, I guess, left over one more reading. I'm not sure. I think somehow this relates, so I'm going to read it. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of Yahweh spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, this is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has commanded me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel. So I think it just kind of fits in. Cyrus is probably not the same caliber as Hitler, but nonetheless, you have a leader who is recognizing Yahweh as being the one who has a role that he is supposed to fill. And Randy?
Since you're closing about the anti-Semitism, I think you also...
Can you put the mic up a little closer?
Since you're closing your thoughts on anti-Semitism, I think you also need to bring out that most of the countries of the world were also anti-Semitic, meaning they would not take the Jews who were trying to flee from Germany, Poland, and the other countries. And they were trying to limit the number that could go to Palestine. So they were not really much more favorable to the Jews than Hitler himself.
Speaking of that, has anyone noticed or heard in the last 2 weeks a news item? I actually do have a few more slides here related to this. This news item, the Anti-Defamation League did a rather extensive survey. This just came out, when was the date? 14th of January. And it talked about nearly half of all adults worldwide hold significant anti-Semitic views, and younger people are more likely to discriminate against Jews, according to an Anti-Defamation League survey released on Tuesday. This is a rather large survey. 58,000 respondents in 103 countries were asked about, I think there was 11 questions they were asked about the Jewish people. And from that, they were able to make a conclusion of whether they were anti-Semitic or not. But it is amazing, the findings. So one of the other things, I think it was like 20 or 25% had not even heard of the Holocaust. You know, imagine that. That's where we're going. And I have there's a map actually showing the percentage of anti-Semitic attitudes. The least anti-Semitic region was Western Europe, up there, 17%, followed by the Americas, North and South at 24%. I guess actually Oceania, which would be Australia, New Zealand, has 20%, so it's actually better. Sub-Saharan Africa, 45%. Eastern Europe, 49%. Asia, 51%. And of course, the Middle East, North Africa, 76%. By country, if it wasn't, Syria, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, if you exclude those countries, you want to guess what the most anti-Semitic country in the world is outside the Middle East? It's Russia. It's Russia. Very, very interesting, I think, in light of Bible prophecy. So that's kind of one of the reasons. It's another one of the many reasons why I think studying anti-Semitism is worthwhile, which we will do next week, Lord willing. So thank you.